Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Meisha-ann Martin, and I am the Director of People Analytics at Workhuman. As you know, this has been a really tough year for pretty much all of us. Lots of things have happened, and we are in the midst of a civil unrest and awakening, so to speak. The events of the past year really got people talking, which was great. While these conversations were so important and even very long overdue, they are just the beginning. I am so delighted to be joined today by Sarah Morgan. And today, together, we're going to talk about how to have sustained movement in this space. Again, my name is Meisha-ann Martin, and I'm the Director of People Analytics here at Workhuman. My professional background, I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, and I have been working for 15 plus years in the people analytics, employee experience, employee engagement space with a special focus on how different people experience work. I also led a talent management function at some point in my career. As you can hopefully see from this slide here, my family means everything to me. My grandparents are both on this slide, the ones that I have remaining, and they are prominently featured on purpose. Without the kinds of sacrifices that they made, I would not be here today, and I am just eternally grateful. The rest of my family is on this slide too. And then lastly, pictured here is the place of my birth and where I grew up, Jamaica. And what you're seeing here is Jamaica from the air. So when I'm in that plane and I see that view, that's probably the happiest I ever get in my whole life because I know that I'm about to go home. All right, Sarah, over to you for your introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Meisha-ann. Hello, everyone. I am Sarah Morgan. I'm the Chief Excellence Officer of BuzzARooney LLC, which is a human resources consulting company where I work with startups and small businesses in helping to build and cultivate inclusive workplace cultures. I'm also still a practicing human resources professional as the head of HR for a retail services conglomerate based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I have been in the social HR space since 2011 when I launched my blog, The Buzz on HR, which still has over 10,000 readers a month. I launched my podcast in 2019, which is called Leading in Color, and it is now in its third season. And I do a ton of influencer work for different HR organizations across the globe, including Workhuman, which is one of my favorites to work with. And I'm glad to be with you all today. Sharing my diversity dimensions is an important thing to me as we work through these kinds of conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I recognize that my diversity dimensions impact the way that I see and interact with the world and the way that the world sees and interacts with me. So I do want to tell you all that I am a mixed race Black woman. I have an invisible disability. I use she, her pronouns. And I am also a wife and a mom with a blended family of 5. We live outside of Durham, North Carolina. And that just gives you an insight into me and my family and who I am and what we do. So now I want to jump into our presentation and talk about what brings us here today. 2020 was truly a year like no other. We had the COVID pandemic. We had the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. We had the deaths of our icons like Kobe Bryant and Chadwick Boseman. There was the presidential election. There was a whole insurrection at our US Capitol. There have been 194 mass shootings in the first 18 weeks of 2021. And it is hard and it is heavy and it is a lot. And even though none of this specifically has anything to do with the workplace. It all impacts the workplace, and our employees are looking to us to lead. They're looking to us to show empathy and courage, and they're looking for us to step up and drive lasting change. In response to that, many organizations issued statements committing and recommitting to diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organizations. However, a year later, we're finding out that many of the organizations haven't made much progress in this area. So then the question becomes, what now? And the answer is keep going. We can't go back to the way things were. The way that these events have changed us, the spark that ignited, that led to worldwide protests, worldwide outrage, and worldwide unity in many respects. We can't just give that up. The impetus that led us to write statements committing ourselves to being more inclusive and to overcoming implicit bias, we can't just throw that all away. The commitment to being flexible, the commitment to being more compassionate at work is not something that we should be giving up on, especially when we see stats like what we're looking at on our screens right now. That is a sobering reminder of how important it is that we continue to fight on. When 75% of our employees still feel like they're being held back in the workplace due to factors that are not related to their skills or experience, we have a responsibility to keep going and to do more. So what we want to talk you through today is how to take the energy of the moments that have happened over the last year and turn that into a movement that will move your organization in the right direction on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the workplace absolutely has the potential, and I would argue the responsibility, to be a healing ground from the hurt and the harm that gets caused by implicit bias and systemic racism, if we choose to. And a few months ago, Dr. Meisha-ann wrote an article that laid out the framework for helping organizations evolve from that moment into a movement. And today, we're going to present that framework plan and offer lots of practical steps on what it is that you can do to create an effective DEI strategy in your workplace. So I want to turn things back over to Dr. Meisha-ann and let her begin to take us through this framework.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. Such powerful comments. You know, when you're saying all of that, it's easy to forget everything that we've been through over this past year. As we mentioned before, people are talking, and that is great. There are even companies that have started to do really important, impactful things in this space. What I see less often, however, is an organization apply the same discipline to this area that you see applied to other areas like branding and marketing. And what I mean by that is taking the time to do a thorough analysis, identify gaps, and come up with a strategy. So we'll attempt to provide some guidance around this today. There are 4 steps that I am proposing for creating an effective DEI strategy. So those are the 4 steps we'll cover today. I want to emphasize, we're presenting this in a linear fashion only for convenience today. It is not at all a linear process. For example, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the first step, which is the diversity audit. You should not at all wait until this step is completely through before you start communicating about what you're doing. You also don't have to be all the way through before you take action on some of what you have found, or even do some symbolic things that will mean things to your workforce. Keep in mind that what we're trying to do is build and maintain momentum. And you'll hear me say momentum a lot today. So these steps should really be overlapping in order to keep that momentum going. All right, so let's get started on the first step, the diversity audit, which because of my background is one of my favorite topics. I'm calling this an audit on purpose. When you think of audit, I'm hoping that you think about a process that is detailed and thorough and exhaustive. This should be all of that. So you want to think critically about every aspect of your employee experience and see where bias might exist so that you can root it out. If you cannot see it, then you cannot fix it. So your job in this process is to really try to find everywhere that can potentially exist. So we're only going to focus on 4 areas today. It's not meant to be comprehensive, but what Sarah and I really want to do is go through some things that you may not have thought about before. So we're going to focus on how you get people into your organization. That's recruitment and selection. Then we're going to talk about how you welcome and integrate people once they've been hired. That's onboarding and orientation. We're going to move on to talk about how you make decisions about talent once people are there. That's talent management. And then we'll talk about how you allocate rewards. So we're going to talk about each of these, but before we get there, as a reminder again, this audit can get really lengthy and really involved. And actually, if you're doing it right, it absolutely should be. But again, our goal is momentum, momentum, momentum. So don't forget to communicate about what you're doing and look for opportunities for quick wins along the way. All right, so I'm going to jump into the first part of the diversity audit, which is recruitment and selection. What you're trying to do here is get a broad, diverse pool of people who are well qualified for the role. So you need to think about, where are you going to find all these wonderful people? Please try to think beyond the schools you've always been to and the job boards you've already used. If you need help thinking more broadly and you have affinity and resource groups in your organization, please utilize those groups. Ask them what you should be doing. Maybe even consider appointing a liaison from each group to work with you in detail on where you should really be going in order to get a diverse candidate pool. You also want to make sure that your postings are attractive to different types of people. As an example, there's all this research out there that shows that certain words and certain phrases are more appealing to men than they are to women. If you Google gender decoder, you should be able to find a free gender decoder online. You can literally cut and paste the language from your job posting into this free decoder, and it will give you some suggestions for how to make your that posting more job neutral. As another example, we've all seen these lengthy requirement lists on these job postings, and usually they have something like a bachelor's degree. Does that job really require a bachelor's degree? We know that there's unequal access to education. If you can take that off because the job doesn't necessarily need it, you already will attract a broader pool of candidates for that role. Lastly, I want you to be on the lookout for unintended consequences. For example, I know a lot of companies in a well-intentioned way have insisted on having at least one woman or person of color in the final slate of candidates for interview. And that sounds great. And it is. Unfortunately, I've also heard of some of these same companies who fulfill this requirement and check the box, but then what ends up happening is that they reject women and minorities at a disproportionately higher rate. Talk about killing your brand in the marketplace. Word gets around, people don't even want to apply. So in order to avoid this blind spot, I really strongly recommend that you look at the pass rates or drop-off rates at every stage of your process to make sure that each stage is unbiased and you're not missing anything. So Sarah, what do you think?
I really appreciate you talking about the drop-off points because it's such an important piece that we miss. We prematurely pat ourselves on the back for having a diverse slate of candidates, but then we fumble at the goal line by not actually carrying that through and hiring someone from a diverse background. And so the diversity in our organization gets no better, even though our pipelines are fine. So we have to be very, very intentional and mindful about that in the decisions that we're making. And like you said, continue to monitor what is happening at every stage, and also continue to monitor the hiring managers and the decisions that they're making. Because if one particular hiring manager is continuing to see drop off, that may be a person who has some bias that needs to be uncovered and addressed. So definitely look out for that. The other thing that you mentioned is broadening your search area. And I think that this is another important pro tip that we need to latch on to. And the thing that makes organizations uncomfortable with this is that it starts to feel retroactive to like the affirmative action quotas of the 1980s and all the like negativity that's been framed around that. And so when you start talking about recruiting with a specific lens on diversity or an intentional lens on diversity, it makes individuals uncomfortable. My advice is to get over that. That when you are trying to, you cannot increase diversity in your organization without increasing diversity in your organization. And so at some point, you are going to have to make an intentional decision to hire a woman, a candidate of color, someone else from a marginalized identity. There are tons of websites that are focused on that now. There are tons of search firms that are led by individuals focused on bringing underrepresented groups into key positions within organizations. You also have colleges and universities that are focused on that. The HBCUs, of course, but then also your other colleges and universities, your private white institutions, so to speak, are also focused on that. And you can find, and you will find quality candidates there. No one is asking you to lower your standards in order to bring diverse candidates into your organization. In fact, when you dig into it, you find that they are just as qualified, if not more, than the other referrals and legacy candidates and nepotism candidates that you may be getting from other sources. So don't discount that. We don't ever say so-and-so's nephew or golf buddy or whoever is not qualified to be in the organization. And so we shouldn't think that way about someone from an underrepresented group.
Oh my gosh, so many good things in what you just said. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to onboarding and orientation. There are a few questions to ask yourself when you're trying to figure out if you're inclusive in the way you welcome people into your organization. The first question is general. Is your culture welcoming to different types of people? To find out, you could just ask. You could do an onboarding survey and see how different people answer the questions. You could include an inclusion index and see how different people answer that. Also, if you're a Workhuman customer, you can use our data to examine new hire networks to see if there are differences in speed of connection or breadth of networks depending on someone's demographic. The second question has to do with your actions. What are you doing to make sure the culture is inclusive and welcoming? As an example, are you purposefully helping new hires build those relationships that will establish themselves as part of your organization's community? Every organization has some people that you really ought to know. So do you know who those people are? Do all your new hires get equal access to these people? Or is it just kind of happening, under the quiet, and some people get access to those people and some people don't? Again, if you're a Workhuman customer, we can use recognition data to help you objectively identify who those people are so that you can strategically connect all your new hires to the right people. The third question is also about your actions. What do you do to really say, you know what, we're so glad you're here, and to make people feel it? When I joined Workhuman last year, before I even started working, I got a box that when I opened it up, it said on the inside, you are just the human that we have been looking for. It was such a delightful surprise. And, I had my little Workhuman cup in the box too. You can tell me nothing. Many of our customers, in order to promote the same feeling, they have and use new hire awards. They make sure that their new hire gets an award early on in their tenure, and then individuals in the organization can chime in on that award to really welcome the new person to the organization. Our data says that this approach really works. We've done this across a number of different clients, and we've cut new hire turnover up to 50%, depending on the client you're looking at. So Sarah, what do you think?
First of all, I am totally going to be taking that idea about the welcome box. That is amazing. And I love that you use the word delighted, because that's what our onboarding and orientation experiences should be for people. It should be delightful. We get so caught up in these ideas about compliance, right? We got to make sure that we have people's paperwork filled out, and we got to make sure that we have their I-9 and their direct deposit and all of those sorts of things, that we forget on the other side of this is a brand new person who's looking to connect and to have like an experience with your organization. And guess what? Like, no one ever said, wow, that was a really efficient I-9 process. I love that. Like, that makes me feel at home here. Not happening. So what we need to be focused on is cultivating an experience. And when I work with clients, we talk about that. As you are going through with new hires and communicating with them, what is it that you want them to feel? And what are the things that you want to do to make sure that this individual feels like they are welcomed, that this is the place that they've always belonged, that they are the human you were looking for. Like that is the goal. And you may not have budget for a box, but you probably have budget for pens or a card that's signed by their incoming coworkers or something along those lines. Like there is always a way that you can build that magic into your onboarding process. And I cannot overemphasize how important that is. Compliance is important too. I won't ever, negate that fact, but you can have both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. When you think about it intentionally and you look at it from the perspective of, I'm crafting an experience to make someone feel welcome and connected in this organization, that's how you make that magic happen.
You are so right, Sarah. The I-9 does not spark joy.
None. There is no joy. No, there is none to be found.
All right, so let's move on to talent management. We have been doing talent management as a field pretty much the same way for quite some time, and we're getting the same old results. And what I mean by that is, in organizations, you typically see the worker bees are diverse, but then as you go up the upper levels of the organization, you see far less diversity. That is partly because of our talent practices and the environment that we create within organizations. So let's talk about how organizations identify high potentials and successors. Usually, there are only a few people in the organization who are making these decisions. And they're naturally going to default to who they know and who they've worked with before. So the question is, how do we get others into this process within organizations who may not have had visibility and exposure to the people making these decisions? Again, this is a fantastic use case for recognition data. You can use the wisdom of the crowd. Who is the organization valuing? And to get more specific, who is the organization valuing for those skills that are critical to the future of your organization, like, perhaps innovation? Those are the individuals that need to be on your high potential and successor list. And if they weren't already there, now you know that these are individuals that need more visibility. You should also be looking at your promotion practices with a similarly critical eye. Who is making those decisions? What is the process for that? And where might bias creep in? And what can you do to make it broader? Sarah, I know you got a take on this one. What do you think?
Yeah, this is so critical to breaking beyond just that visual diversity that we always seem to be so focused on, where, like you said, the worker bees ends up being very diverse, but the higher you go in the organization, the less likely it is that you see diversity. And it really is about, it's an issue of cultural conditioning. Those of us who come from marginalized identities and traditionally underrepresented groups, we are conditioned to think that if we work hard, keep our heads down, do the work, show up, give excellence, be on time, deliver our deliverables, all of those sorts of things, that someone from somewhere will recognize that and move us forward, open the door for us to be into some sort of promoted position. When the truth is that matters, but also who you know matters and who you interact with matters. And the visibility, I love when you use that word, the visibility matters. And so often our employees who come from traditionally underrepresented groups are not visible. Mm-hmm. And when they don't get identified as high potentials and have that opportunity to move up in the organization, they go from lacking visibility to feeling invisible. And then they disconnect. And they may leave your organization and take their talent somewhere else and be fantastic. But what's worse is that they stay, continuing to feel invisible and just kind of withering out there, feeling like they're not seen and that they're not being given the opportunity. So what we need to do to overcome this is create transparency in our processes. People need to know, what is the process for me to be able to raise my hand and say, I want more?
Oh my gosh, what you said about this really gives me goosebumps, and it's going to stick with me. I particularly love the phrase, lack of visibility leading people to feel invisible, and the word withering. I mean, it rings true too, because, I've seen cases where people are leaving organizations and then they're told, oh, but you were a high potential. And the person's like, I
didn't know that.
I'm supposed to know. All right, so let's move on to rewards. So we've talked about pay equity a lot over the years, and there are lots of partners out there who can help you, and they do a fantastic job. But pay equity typically only takes into account things like base salary, bonus, and sometimes maybe long-term incentives. But what about the rewards that are given out in other organizations that are not quite so formal? So let's say, for example, you have a drawer full of gift cards. I know a lot of you do, and you give them out as on-the-spot rewards when someone does something well. There may be some bias in how those rewards are distributed, but because you don't track it as an organization, it's invisible to the organization. But you know who it's not invisible to? Those people who never get a gift card. Those people notice. And they likely feel demoralized and excluded. And to use Sarah's word, they're probably withering. All right. When you formalize this kind of process, it means that you can get data out of it that you can examine. We have done that for several clients over this past year, and we consistently find differences. We find that women get more awards, but those awards tend to be lower in value. And we find the same kind of pattern for whites versus minorities. Whites tend to get the highest award amounts in value, and minorities tend to get lower. Some of our clients are now using our inclusion advisor to help close some of the gaps that they're seeing in their data. And I'll talk more about the inclusion advisor in a bit. But Sarah, what do you think about this one?
Oh, the ability for bias to creep in when reward systems are not communicated and formalized and tracked is so rampant. And it is so important, even if it is just writing down the names of who got the gift card and what the amounts were, so that you can refer back to it and see where there may be patterns like the ones that you just mentioned, where women are receiving less, people of color are receiving fewer or lesser amounts. Those sorts of things are so important in finding and rooting out and overcoming the bias that exists in our organization. And sometimes that bias may not even be specifically based in someone's identity and belonging to a traditionally marginalized group. It could just be old-fashioned favoritism, where I'm getting the gift card based on how much you like me or don't like me because we root for the same team or went to the same school or some other arbitrary thing like that. And so I love that you talk about having ways to, even when the rewards are informal in nature, still having formal ways to track that and make sure that it gets reported so that you can be looking at what is going on and the potential bias in it.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the next phase where Sarah is going to present and then I'm going to respond.
All right, so let's get into it. So let me get to my notes. So the second step in our process is talking about making a plan. This is the moment where you take the data that you gathered from your diversity audit. And again, as Dr. Meisha-ann mentioned earlier, you don't have to do the complete audit and look at all the areas. You can finish one area and then start to make the plan on that area. So when it comes to DEI, you have to have commitment from the top. It is crucial for your executive level to be just as committed, in tune, visible, vocal when it comes to the areas of DEI as they are about revenue and profit and new product launches and all of those kinds of things. Also, having a task force is another thing that is mentioned in the framework for this that I agree is very, very important. One person in your organization did not create this issue. One person or one department within your organization cannot fix this issue. So you have to make sure that you have a group of individuals represented across all the major areas, your operations, your marketing, your support groups, your accounting groups. You've got to make sure that you have representation from all of those areas as a part of your task force. It has to be a team effort that trickles down from the very top all the way into the front lines of your organization. The other thing that's very important is that your task force needs to be as diverse as your organization's demographics will allow. And I say that knowing that organizations at times are lacking in diversity. And so then what do you do? And my recommendation, truthfully, is get a consultant for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, even our most culturally competent white person still has major blind spots. And it is still going to be very difficult for them to necessarily speak and connect with some of the employees at the lower levels of the organization who may be experiencing things because of that trust factor that I mentioned earlier. So engaging a consultant of color will help to show the seriousness of your organization in taking this. Like, we're investing money and bringing in someone from the outside to help us to do this and to move this plan forward. And secondly, it inserts that voice of marginalized individuals into the process that you would be lacking because of the diversity that you don't have yet in your organization. Dr. Meisha-ann, talk a little bit about what you would add here, specifically around timing.
Yeah, so I'm going to use the M word again, which is momentum. So in order to keep people feeling like things are happening, make sure that your plan includes a good mix of short-term things that you can do quickly and then longer-term actions that are more, strategic in nature. Even before you start to get any results in from your audit, there are things you can do to get the ball rolling. Think about some of these symbolic things. Having a senior leader talk about this issue, or, adding your pronouns to your signature or to your Zoom profile. Those are great examples of symbolic things you can do, or the gender decoder that I mentioned before. Those are things that you don't have to wait on the diversity audit necessarily in order to be able to do those things. I also want to pick up on something you mentioned, which is, a single person didn't create this issue. So a single person shouldn't necessarily be the one fixing it. So I want to talk about the idea of burdening women and people of color with fixing the same problems that they're suffering from. In this instance, please do not just find a woman or a person of color and make them do this work if they haven't volunteered. That is a burden. And then lastly, think through how you want your allies to participate. There are so many people and organizations that are not necessarily one of, but they want to stand with, and that is great. Give them something to do, okay? Make sure that they know how they can support and contribute to the effort. Make that clear. That's how you create a groundswell and again, contribute to that momentum and that sustained movement.
Yes, thank you for adding those pieces about the burden and the importance of allyship and the importance of continuing that momentum cannot be understated or overstated as we move through the rest of this framework and as you are making a plan for how you want to move forward. Thank you. So moving on to step 3. So this is where committing publicly and specifically is going to come into play. Communication is important. Your employees need to be clear about your intentions. They need to understand what the process is going to be and what it's going to look like. They need to know the timeline. They want to know the methods, the history, and the context of the approach that you're taking. Anything that you think that you should be sharing with them is probably something that you should be sharing with them at this moment. The other thing that is really important to remember here is creating space for employees to give you feedback. Take this opportunity to learn from your employees about their ideas and also about their experiences. As Dr. Meisha-ann mentioned earlier, that burden. There are employees who are having difficult experiences in their lives and also inside your organization. And you cannot run from that. You have to be willing to allow them to speak that to you and know that it's safe for them to say that and know that you're going to take that information in and that you're going to do something about it. So often we tell individuals to show up to work and to be authentic and to be their whole selves. And then we fail at asking them what their experiences actually are. We fail at listening to them, allowing them to be honest, and then offering them proper support. And our failure in that way leads so many people with marginalized identities and from underrepresented groups to feel as though our talents are wanted, our outputs are wanted, but our humanity is not. And that is something that we have to get over and move beyond. We have to see people as whole individuals and give them space to talk openly about their experiences, ask them what it is that they need to feel supported and to heal, and then go do that. That is the key right now, and the most important thing that you can do alongside the other steps in your plan. And then before I bring Dr. Meisha-ann back in, I want to jump to step 4. Just like any of the other key areas of your business, what gets measured gets improved. So you have to measure your progress with your DEI strategy efforts. That begins with your audit, and then it has to carry through in each one of the other steps. And your task force should be meeting regularly to talk about the things that you measured, what the data is saying, and then how that is going to drive us forward in the plan. The other thing that your task force needs to be doing is sharing that information with the employees. What we've talked about in previous is the importance of communication and the importance of transparency. And what I see far too often in organizations that I work with is that they do these audits. They may survey the employees to get their feedback and information about their experiences. The information comes back, it's not good. And then they want to hide the information, or they want to massage the data somehow to make it seem better. People with marginalized identities don't get to pick and choose what we share. So much of our lives, in order for us to be seen and safe and valued and included, so much of that requires us to just like lay ourselves bare, to just put our pain out there, to put our harm out there in order for us to be taken seriously. There's so much of us that we have to expose for others to judge and deem worthy. And that is an exhausting, heavy heart existence. Yeah. And so if your employees with marginalized identities can do that day after day, week after week, year after year, coming into your workplace with all of their outside experiences and whatever experiences they're having at their job, you can do it for a couple of hours while you deliver the data from these reports. You can do it for a Zoom meeting while you share with them the results of a survey that were not good. You can do it, and you have to do it. Yeah. And so good DEI is going to make you uncomfortable. It's going to make you feel sad. It's going to make you feel disappointed. And all of those feelings should be propelling you forward to do better. And you got to get over it, and you got to get into it instead, is really the thing. Dr. Meisha-ann, I know you got a lot to add, so I'm going to stop talking and let you say what you say your part. I see you nodding over there. So I know
yes, get over it and get into it. I resemble some of these remarks, and I agree with everything that you're saying. It's hard, right? So the conversations are happening. They're good. People are finally listening to people who have had not so pleasant things happen. But we need to remember, as we're listening to the experiences of women and people of color, when they're sharing and they're putting themselves out there, that's emotional labor. So people are revisiting their traumas, they're talking about how they're afraid for their children. This is really heavy stuff, and organizations need to honor that. So on the one side, you're asking employees to lay their soul bare so that other people can understand, and that's fine. But then you want to hide your numbers and not be transparent about where you're not doing well. That's not right. That is not right. So the other thing, I want to talk about a little bit is vulnerability. Again, you're asking people to be vulnerable. And I'm saying that we should honor that vulnerability and reciprocate in kind. So when things don't look good, share it. When you're disappointed, say that. If something didn't work as expected, be honest about it. Don't spin it. Don't try to sugarcoat it. And as a bonus, there's all this research out there that tells us that when people are vulnerable with each other, that's how you create trust and connection. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here. So speaking of trust and connection, I want to talk a little bit about the place of recognition in an inclusion strategy. Recognition can and should be part of a diversity and inclusion strategy. If you think about it, it is a way to let people know I see you. And not only do I see you, but I appreciate what you're bringing to the table. That is really powerful. And our research tells us that this strategy works. In one study we did with Ohio Health, we found that the more employees gave and received before the employee engagement survey, the more likely they were to say that they felt included. We found something similar recently with a large financial services client, even though most of the employees were working from home. So even though people were not physically in front of each other, those who received monetary recognition were more likely to say they felt connected to their colleagues. It's incredible. Taking the time to reflect on what you appreciate about a colleague and having them do the same way for you is a great way to create an inclusive community. So recognition definitely plays a role in creating a more inclusive workplace and an equitable workplace, and the results are absolutely astounding. After a year in a recognition program, Asian, Black, and Hispanic turnover drops 20%, and female turnover drops 17%. As we've been working with our clients over this past year to uncover the differences that people are having in terms of experience in organizations, we found ourselves as a company wanting to do more. And so what we did was we developed our new Inclusion Advisor feature so that we can close some of these gaps that we're seeing in these different organizations. The Inclusion Advisor can be configured to nudge nominators to make sure that they're including all the right people on a team award, to make sure that the monetary value that they're associating with a recognition is appropriate. And lastly, it also includes the industry's first and only AI-driven in-the-moment coaching that mitigates unconscious bias in real time. So I know that's a lot of words, so let me explain. As an individual is writing a recognition message, the coaching tool will use our proprietary taxonomy that's driven by our natural language processing to identify potential microaggressions. It will privately, it won't tell your leader, okay? It will privately flag these phrases in real time, explain why that language may be perceived negatively, and propose alternatives. So it's reinforcing diversity and inclusion in your business in real time. I'm pretty excited about it. So Sarah, take us home. Where do we go from here?
So where we go from here is exactly what this slide says, is we have to drive awareness. We have to become more aware of ourselves in terms of how we show up and how the ways in which we communicate can make individuals around us feel othered or excluded. We have to take action, which we have given y'all tons of action steps that you can walk away from. And we have to create that lasting change by not giving up, by taking each little step, each little moment of momentum to keep this movement going. And together, I believe that we absolutely can create healing and drive the way forward through business. If not us, who? And if not now, when? This is the perfect opportunity for us to take that moment into a movement and use momentum to create the change that we have been saying over and over and over again for years that we want to see. I, for one, don't want to have to keep having these conversations year after year. I want it to be different. I know I can speak for Dr. Meisha-ann and say the same. And so together, I believe that we really can make this happen using this framework and then taking the steps one by one to keep progress going. And so with that, we are going to stop talking and we are going to open this up for questions and answers.
Thank you, Meisha-ann and Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation. We do have some questions coming in. The first one is, how does the speaker define progress that is expected from the companies she has said have not made progress? What are the measures?
Yeah, so I saw that particular question come in pretty early, just as we were in the introductory section. So I'm wondering if that was before we kind of jumped into it. But still, I think the important thing to ask in terms of, for the organizations who previously made statements who may not have made as much progress or may not have made any progress beyond the statements that were made, is what, have you started your audit? Have you looked at the diversity within your or the lack of diversity within your organization to see where it is that you're lacking and what improvements you need to make? And then have you made a plan for how you're going to make those improvements? Has that plan been communicated to your employees at all levels? Because that buy-in that we talked about is so very important, and making sure that your key leaders within your organization, particularly, you know, in most organizations that's the C-suite, but in some organizations it may not be. Like, whoever those key individuals are, those influencers within your organization, they need to be very vocal and very visible as you're moving toward communicating your plan, and then start executing upon the things that you have planned to do. One of the things when I work with clients, I put together a roadmap for them, because at the end of this audit, then at the end of the audit, it can feel overwhelming, all the information that is there for you to do. And so I break that down for them and say, okay, over the next 3 months, we're going to do this. And then the 3 months after that, we're going to do this. So we take this journey in kind of 90-day sprints. And I encourage you all to look at it in that same way, because as we kept saying during the thing, this is about momentum. Solving systemic issues is not going to happen in a few weeks or even a few months. It's going to take a considerable amount of time.
Great, thank you. The next question that came in: when and how will the Inclusion Advisor be available to employers?
So the Inclusion Advisor is an optional add-on to our social recognition program. That is in the beta testing phase right now, and we have a couple of organizations that are already on board with that. So it's already out there, it's already started. The initial results are great. More than 70% of people who have had recommended language changes to what they're writing in the recognition message, over 70% of those people have actually taken those changes. So it is a positive indicator to us that people are getting more aware and you know, making the appropriate changes and writing more positive things with less probability that those will be taken not so nicely by women and people of color in particular.
Okay, great. Another question came through the chat. You said the first step is the diversity audit. What ways or tools do you suggest for conducting the audit, particularly a measurable process with benchmark indicators?
Yeah, so the article, and I probably should post a link in the chat to the actual article that this webinar came from. It has a lot more detail in terms of the recommended steps for the diversity audit. But in general, it is thinking about the metrics that you already have and how you look at them. So your applicant tracking system, there's data already in there, right? So breaking that down for each step and looking at pass rates as an example. Engagement surveys are a great one. But instead of just looking at the mean, which I like to say the mean hides a multitude of sins, look at how different people are answering the questions in order to see if there are differences. So in some cases, when we're looking at HR metrics like engagement, we're looking at the mean and comparing that to an external benchmark. In this case, what you're doing is looking at your metrics and looking for differences between groups of people and hoping that you find nothing. If you find nothing, good on you. I've never found nothing. I'll be honest with you. So your turnover rates, right? Like making sure that they're not different for different groups of people. So it's about looking at the data that you have, getting creative in how you look at it, and looking for group differences. I do see another question here about more contemporary survey info, and I want to talk to that for a little bit. We at Workhuman, we do a number of independent surveys all the time. We did one in March, I think, of this year in the US, and we're currently launching one that's more global. And one of the things we looked at was, a couple of things we looked at was psychological safety and trust. And psychological safety, if you're not familiar with that construct, it has to do with feeling like you can be your authentic self, like you can speak up and contribute and ask questions and have no negative consequences associated with those things. And when we looked at the differences in that feeling by gender and by race, again, we found differences up to this year. We found that women felt less psychologically safe, minorities felt less psychologically safe, parents felt less psychologically safe. We also found trust and leadership differences. So it's not that there hasn't been progress. People are now more aware, and that is fantastic. But what we don't want is to stop at awareness, because there are still things that we need to fix and movement and momentum that needs to happen.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in, what would you say is the most difficult part of implementing a D&I program?
Whew. In the clients that I work with, it is discomfort with change, because naturally we talk about, people don't like change. And this type of change feels even more difficult because it flies in the face of so much of our social and even educational conditioning, that we often feel like something is wrong with it, or that it's this really radical concept that's going to completely, collapse our business as we know it, despite all the data that says doing these things will make your organization more successful. We still feel like that can't quite be trusted, right? So it's the resistance to change that I find is the most difficult in overcoming this particular issue and in implementing the plan. Like, everyone likes the awareness part of it, because there's a part of cultivating awareness that strangely feels good. Mm-hmm. It's like I'm learning something that I didn't know before that makes me a better person, right? And then but now it's like time for me to go beyond just my own awareness and start to change things for others. And we start to worry that by improving the circumstances of one group of individuals, that we're somehow now disenfranchising someone else, and we start to struggle within that. And all of that is just internalized supremacy conditioning. And so we have to not only fight against our natural instinct against changing things, but then we also have to fight against all of that societal and educational conditioning that's based in capitalism and patriarchy and supremacy that we have to overcome.
Great, thank you, Sarah. It looks like we are at time. So just want to thank everyone for listening and joining us today. Thank you, Sarah and Meisha-ann. This was a great session.